Now we have some time, and I'm sure each of you has had a chance to think very carefully about what's been happening, even if only briefly. The resonances ring. So there's going to be time to have a short discussion in which we may be able to have the opportunity for you to ask questions. So maybe perhaps we can get a couple of chairs and bring them out here, and that way you can put your questions to Neil and Scott. Let me ask a positive question, Scott, to you first, and Neil, you can reflect on it as well. We're seeing here today an example of an aspiration towards something of the values that Neil has outlined. This is a small gathering. But are we seeing, in your experience in the United States, through all the difficulties you mentioned, the Trump, in the lifting of the fog, the beginnings of those communities of hope? And what are the significant signs for you that people are beginning to reach out and find those things which, yes, there are differences, but the differences which are creative and the differences which are positive?
So, good news and bad news. So good news and bad news. I think the good news is that there's been an increase in what's frequently called intersectionality in terms of communities that feel in one way or another vulnerable or on the margins, understanding that the only way to sort of insulate themselves from some of the harsher effects of powerful forces that threaten to further marginalize and oppress them is to sort of find common cause with one another. So that's very hopeful. The bad news is that in terms of what's perceived to be the huge fault lines in the political character of the society, no one's talking to each other. So in other words, while the differences that may have some of the differences that may have existed between African American churches and the LGBT community might be receding into the background in the interest of making common cause against some of the policies of the Trump administration. No one is really thinking on the left or on the right of finding ways to talk to each other across that divide. So it just seems like the mutual demonization is getting worse and worse.
Neil, do you want to respond to that? Let me offer another little sort of hand grenade into that. Another old saying, it's often been said through history, it was said to me as a young kid, the darkest point on a train journey is when it's about to emerge from the tunnel. Are we in that sort of situation? And what's your reflection as you look at it personally?
Oh, gee. Look, there's a term that I'll use, which it's a philosophical term called ressentiment, which is the sort of refeeling of resentment where a particular value or a particular good has been promoted and the person can't achieve it, and it becomes a festering sore for them. And I think we live in cultures where people are fostering resentment. Dare I say, in the States it's very evident in Fox News. And what it's done is turn a culture against certain values so that knowledge is seen as elitist, education is seen as elitist, gentleness is seen as weakness, humility is seen as foolish, love is soft. And that's sort of fueling this political upheaval and unrest. We don't have it quite so bad in Australia, I think, but you see it in the sort of One Nation, Pauline Hanson type movement of festering resentment against elites. What's significant, of course, this is being fostered by certain elites for their own purposes. And they're fostering it, I think, in a massive sort of anti-democratic move to try and reinstate more authoritarian forms of government, which we've seen in Turkey, we're seeing in possibility in the US, and the desire for the strong person to see us through this problem. I don't think we're seeing any light at the end of the tunnel just yet, John.
Well, let me ask you both to share one other observation and then I'll open it up to questions. In that situation, you've both outlined, and Neil particularly, you referred to it, to the fact that the root elements of conflictual difference are not to be found in religion. They're to be found in sort of deeper and more underlying resentments which our society has. The great moments of religion through history have been when religion has offered the alternative and traditionally has proved to be the vehicle for the alternative. If I think of South Africa, which has been referred to, if you look at the origins of the dilemmas in South Africa, many would say it was religious, that groups like the Broederbond and white exclusivity and all of that led to the dreadful things of apartheid. But if you look at the 1980s and 1990s and you look at the work of people like Tutu and Mandela on one side, but in the Dutch Reformed community, people like Johan Haynes and Beyers Naudé and others ultimately proved the bridge builders. That out of religion, recognising the profound nature of difference, came the capacity to build those bridges. Do you both want to reflect on that just briefly?
Look, religion can, and this is why I still find putting it into the box of religion is problematic. Yes, if you look at that box called religion, you see both these, opportunities for enormous flourishing and opportunities for complete perversion of that flourishing. So what is it that allows people to flourish in that situation? I think they're, to me, the more important questions. Religion, one would hope, and as a religious person myself, I would hope that religion is a vehicle for human flourishing, and in its different forms, it does contribute significantly to that. But I also have to acknowledge that there are movements outside religion that contribute to human flourishing. I have to acknowledge that, as I said, the differences within religion are sometimes greater than those differences between those who are religious and those who are outside. So I think we've got to get past those sort of boxes and look at the qualities of life that enable people to forgive, that encourage forgiveness, and particularly in those sort of historical situations of resentments that go over decades or centuries. What will enable us to move forward when even appeals to justice are no longer capable of being fulfilled because the resentments are so complex, long and complex and interwoven with all sorts of other things happening, that in the end forgiveness is the only thing that allows you to move forward?
It's a great question. I suppose as a student of religion, I would say that the category of religion is highly problematic. And most of the time when others use it and I use it, I don't quite know what I'm talking about. No, because it's, as Geertz, to go back to Geertz once said, that these big terms like religion, art, politics are meant to help us order complexity, not reduce it. And actually, we use them more often than not to try to reduce complexity. So that's part of the problem. But I would say that if I were to talk about sort of Christian values, teaching, Christian faith, it's interesting that in the New Testament you don't have the term religion really. Jesus talks a lot about pistis, about what's translated as faith. In the Quran, the word religion occurs a couple times. Islam or submission is said to be what religion, deen, is all about. But a word that occurs far more frequently is iman, which is the Arabic word for faith. And one of the things that strikes me as comparable between both of these terms and the context of the two sort of human beings who seem to be at the center of the messages of both the Quran and the New Testament, i.e. the Prophet Muhammad and Jesus. Faith is all about challenging the construction of identities, not giving you the most solid building block on which to build your identity. Now that's my interpretation, but if it struck any of you as radical to hear me say this, then you'll get a sense of what I think the problem is. Because most people who identify themselves as religious tend to do so, and I put myself in the same category, as a way of understanding who they are more and more statically, understanding what the boundaries of the self are, less and less porously, trying to have more fixity in a world and an experience that's full of fluidity. And actually, when I read the New Testament, when I read the Quran, when I try to reflect in my own life about the good news of Jesus Christ, or even as a non-Muslim, that believes in the revelatory truth of the Quran, reflect on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, I think to use the call of these two men in the name of God to justify building identities that are firm, solid, and ultimately exclusive is a gross misinterpretation. However, it's the way it's been done for centuries and continues to be. It's normative.
Time for just a couple of questions. We've got a microphone here, so we might...
Yeah, I can do the...
Oh, wow.
You want me to, okay, I can do that.
Thank you very much to both speakers. I'm very interested to hear that the major emphasis still seems to be on religion, which is seeming to create more problems. I would be interested, of course, we could have hour-long lectures about this. I would be interested to hear opinions about the problems of attachment. Attachment in the world seems to be an enormous problem. I would also suggest that most problems are generated by a basic fear and feeling of insecurity. What is responsible for this, in my opinion, is ignorance. As far as I'm concerned, it is ignorance which is at the base of many of our problems.
I thank you very much for your comment and insight. I'm not sure if there's a question. I mean, I really appreciate the wisdom and insight. I mean, it sounds a little bit like there's something of the teaching of the Buddha in what you said in terms of the problem being attachment and craving. And I think, this is where interreligious dialogue and comparative theology, problematic term obviously in an interreligious context, can be so enriching. Because we can learn so much from the different ways in which we conceive of the problems we face. And so thank you for throwing that into the mix.
Another question?
In the contemporary climate, there seems to be, following up on your comments about identity, sort of identity politics. It's Catholic identity asserted over against, or Muslim identity asserted over against. It's liberal, it's conservative. It's all this strong...
National identity too, let's not forget that.
There's all sorts of them. How can we better promote coexistence rather than us against them? That's the...
That's the $65,000 question, right? I mean, I think if we began in our churches and our mosques, if we're talking about religious people, right, and interfaith, I think we really have to put each other's feet to the fire to embrace what one might be tempted to call a new paradigm, but what I think is the original paradigm. And that we always have to be asking ourselves not how our faiths can be used to make us feel more comfortable, in the identities we have created for ourselves, but less comfortable. And that the discomfort that feeling less comfortable engenders often really draws us closer to one another and to God. Isn't then, I think we have, anxiety, right, works on this principle, right, that what you fear is often far worse than the reality, right? That's the nature of anxiety itself, right? So that you become trapped in the fear we've been talking about because you've imagined the reality that you don't want to face to be far worse than it actually is. And when you actually can just face the reality, you realize there was nothing to be afraid of. That you can be free from your fear by just facing the reality. But I'm not sure that we do a good job at all, teaching our children about this very important aspect of our faith traditions. And I guess connected with that on the education and dialogue, sort of on a more practical and kind of less abstract and philosophical level, we do an awfully good job, don't we, I'll just speak about Christians and Muslims, as Christians and Muslims, teaching our children what to think as Christians and Muslims. I think we do an awfully poor job of teaching our children how to think as Christians and Muslims. And I think one of the reasons we do a poor job at the latter is because it's very dangerous when you teach people how to think with their tradition. Why? Because, and forgive the gross caricature here, when the preacher gets up and preaches, the preacher doesn't mind very much whether someone walks out bored or not terribly stimulated or disagreeing in some vague sense or even angry by something the preacher said. But what the preacher doesn't ever want is a bunch of people coming up to him or her, questioning the usage of that particular passage and why something else was not used, et cetera. I don't understand why, because that would seem to be the richest kind of congregational life. Other than to say that this is the other thing about identity is power, and the idea that the way you conserve and use power is to conserve knowledge in certain ways and assign the ability to know things and think through things only to certain people.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. My observation would just be that identity politics always arises at times of significant social stress and change. And it's one way of trying to deal with that stress and change. So in our church, in the Catholic Church, the change engendered by Vatican II after 10, 15 years resulted in the emergence of strong identity politics within the church as a way of trying to limit and control the directions of that change. And I think that's the same thing we're experiencing in Australian politics and perhaps in the politics of the US as well. Significant large-scale social change, globalisation, migration, all these economic shifts which cause anxiety. And one way of trying to deal with that, and it's not a very successful way of dealing with that, is through identity politics in its various forms. And I think you need other ways of trying to deal with the difficulties. I mean, yes, there is an underclass of resentment that's present, say, in US context and our context in Australia. People who have been left behind by change. So that needs to be acknowledged, dealt with, and the hurt of that dealt with. But if we allow it to become a reassertion of identity politics, then we get exactly what happened in the US.
I'll just say also, I'm very attracted to Pope Francis's notion of the church being a field hospital in the culture wars and not taking part in the culture wars. And in some ways, the way that ought to be received in the United States, particularly by the US bishops, is that for many, many years now, the The U.S. bishops have taken part in the culture wars. They've staked their side in the culture wars. And what the Holy Father is trying to say is that really the church is a healing and reconciling sacrament in the human family. It's designed to transform and give life to the human family through healing and reconciliation. So when the church, particularly as manifest in its hierarchy, which has a very important role in the life of the church, kind of just takes side for whatever issue, whatever it might be the issue, but clearly just takes sides, it loses its capacity to do what it's needed most to do in the world, and that is to be a place for healing and dialogue and reconciliation.
We've run out of time. This has been a fabulous discussion. It's been a privilege for all of us to be here today. Thanks to Ahmet and the folk here at Affinity, but would you particularly thank our guests, Scott Alexander and Neil Ormerod?
Thank you,